I know almost everybody here, but if you don't know me, I'm Rick Bierschbach. I'm the interim president of the university right now. But up until 4 weeks ago, I was the dean of the law school here at Wayne State, and I started in that role in 2017, which means that for virtually my entire time as the law school dean, Vince was my colleague. And so I feel especially privileged to be able to say just a few things about Vince. And I know there are a lot of people who want to say things, and so I won't be long. I could talk for a long time about Vince. I mean, I think the things that are top of mind for me right now, and I have a little script, but I'm sort of just not going to pay attention to it here, are that Vince really brought people together and was able to see the good in people pretty much all the time, and was able to put their interests and their concerns and their needs in front of his own. And I think you could feel that when you met him almost right away. You could feel that warmth and that authenticity, and the fact that he was somebody who you could trust. And that was certainly how I experienced him as the dean. And I can say that during my time as the dean, I came to value his trust very, very deeply. When you're a dean, and I can say also when you're a president, a lot of people will come and try to give you advice, and they're virtually always well-meaning. But they often always, they often, not always, but they often also have, their own agenda or their own views. And that was not how it was with Vince. He would come to me with only one goal, which would be to help me through whatever situation I was facing or the law school was facing. He never tried to tell me, what to do or what I should do. He would just try to make things better. He would just listen patiently, think about things, and then offer, his observations in a supportive and always incredibly thoughtful way. And his generosity and sincerity, the way he approached those conversations, it always stood out, and it especially stood out in difficult moments where he had the ability to listen with patience and support me, with the best advice and reactions he could. And that kind of genuine care allowed me to be completely unguarded with Vince. And that's a rare thing to be able to do in the role as dean, and honestly a rare thing to be able to do just with anybody, whether you're in a leadership position or not. And I always felt like that was really special, and it was one of the things I loved the most about him. And I learned that pretty early on in my deanship. But then as I came to observe Vince and the way he interacted with the rest of our law school colleagues, and the way he was in meetings when we were talking about difficult issues, I came to see pretty quickly that that experience was not unique to me, that was just how Vince was. And that's how he was with all of our colleagues. He actually was just someone that you could be unguarded with, that you could trust completely. And that he cared for everybody. He approached everybody in that same way. And so his influence reached far beyond the advice he gave to me or the advice he gave to any single person at the law school. His generosity, his trust, and his approach to things, his care, he really brought us together. He was sort of a glue for our community, particularly at the times when we needed a glue the most. And so I'll always be thankful to Vince for that, and I will always try to carry that part of Vince with me as I approach similar situations, because I think it's so rare and so important and so special. It's something we could all aspire to, even if we can't all be the way Vince was in that way. So I'm going to miss Vince incredibly. I know we all here are, in this room, and I'm always going to try to live up to the example he set for me over the last 8 years. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this and to start it off. I know there are a lot of other people who have things to say. I think the last thing I'll say on a lighter note is, man, Vince had a dry sense of humor. And so the only other thing, my experience with him was, sometimes I wasn't sure if he was telling a joke, but once I realized it was a joke, it was really funny. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for your warm welcome and great words about Vince. Laura, Patrick, and I appreciate how much Vince loved teaching and loved teaching at Wayne Law School. We're grateful to be here and to celebrate his many contributions and his life well lived. What I want to share today centers on the day of his passing, but first, a little background. As Vince's retirement approached, I asked him, "What kind of party do you want?" He replied, "Lawyers don't do retirement parties." And as spouses sometimes do, I persisted, promising that he could decide everything, the details and the guest list. The next day, he handed me a list with 109 names. Right. Astonished, I said, who's on the list? And he said, "A handful of friends and the whole law school." I questioned whether he really meant everyone, especially since he pictured our backyard as the venue. He smiled and said, "Yes, it has to be the whole law school." And so it was. I didn't understand why at the time, but it was his party. So fast forward to the morning he died. We had our regular coffee together, and we were looking over the party menu. And he was pleased that so many of you would be there to celebrate his 44 years of teaching and his academic life. He was content. He was joyful. He was excited at the thought of welcoming you into our home. You were very much in his heart that morning as I went off to work. He passed away a few hours later, 5 days before the gathering that he had envisioned, which most of you know. The days that followed were shocking and heartbreaking, as you can imagine, but we found deep comfort in the notes and the vignettes we received from so many of you right away, his colleagues and his students. We cherished the stories and the memories of Vince in the classroom. We read them aloud at the kitchen table, laughing at phrases like, "Govern yourselves accordingly," and "Signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours." And there were tears too, as we felt the kindness behind your words. Through your emails and visits, it became clear why Vince wanted to invite everyone to his retirement party. He listened to you, he valued each of you, and now we understand. And we're profoundly glad he did, as we heard from you. Today, we look forward to listening to your reflections with open hearts, and we thank you for honoring this brilliant, thoughtful man, our beloved husband and father. Thank you.
For those of you that don't know me, I'm Alan Schenk. I've been around here for a very long time. I'm finally going to retire next year. It's 60 and out. Vince and I were colleagues. He, for me and him, only 44 years. As Rick pointed out his dry sense of humor. As Rick also pointed out, that his sincerity, his honesty, I would add his good judgment. That's what we appreciated, we on the faculty appreciated about Vince Wellman. He never raised his voice. He just gave his view. When we both taught at night, we would meet in Vince's office. I stood, since, as the family knows, there was really not much room to sit. Whenever I was concerned about the lack of neatness in my office, I could compare my disorganization to Vince's organized chaos. And then I wouldn't feel so bad. While he kept piles across the office, he seemed to know where everything was. I witnessed Laura spending hours and hours trying to make sense of that chaos, but each pile had its own purpose. Vince and I would talk about family. Vince with his Laura and Patrick, he always spoke effusively about them. I knew who was moving where and what they were doing. He took great pride in you. As I interviewed dozens and dozens of alumni for my book on the history of Wayne Law School, I asked them about their professors. And many discussed how much they appreciated Vince's contract drafting course and how the course helped them in transition to practice. One alum in particular talked about how he used that experience to become an expert in reviewing client contracts. And he had one quite large client. And even after this alum left law practice, the company asked him to come back and review their contracts. What a tribute to Vince. Vince made his mark at Wayne Law School, and I will seriously miss him.
Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Eric Zaks, also another professor at the law school. Been here about 15 years. So I think you have to be operating at a whole nother level to be as intelligent as Vince and still to be as likable as he was. And maybe it was the way that his contributions came across as being more thought-provoking instead of conclusion-demanding. And his approach, which now seems to me to be somewhat of a throwback, was to explore and to consider instead of seeking a particular end because you're right and you know you're right. His approach is our aspirational approach in the classroom, but Vince extended that modesty and generosity to exchanges with everyone. I also learned from Vince another model of collegiality. Collegiality to Vince was not just about the spoken interactions you had with others. It was not about simply being nice or pleasant. It was about the actions you took. In other words, collegiality, like any other virtue, is about how you attach yourself to another person. And Vince, during the darkest part of my career here, placed himself beside me, and we worked together, and he did it because, and I don't really know why he did it, doing what was necessary and right and helpful, that is the correct model of collegiality. And I'm forever grateful for the help and for the model. Vince was present and engaged, and prepared and had thoughts, but wasn't pushy. As he was, it is clear from the tributes in his personal life with family and friends. And similarly, the reason he was so well liked by students was because he was among them, because he was curious, because he gave, because he made the effort, because he was present. And that's what we all ought to aspire to. These are the lessons that we learn from Vince's actions and from his presence. Thank you.
When I heard about this event, I immediately told Olive that I was going to ask her for thoughts to remind me about Vince, and she quickly sent off a list of comments and observations and copied the associate dean, who got back and said, "Oh, why don't you speak?" And Olive declined, but I persuaded her that we could have a conversation, and so we're going to cover a couple of things. But I want to just begin by saying that we actually had a retirement event for 4 people who were leaving the law school at the end of the year, including Vince. And those of you who were there will remember that Tony Dilloff gave a breathtakingly marvelous set of remarks immediately before Vince. And so Vince did what many people do, which is to say, you know, you should not follow Tony Dilloff in something like this. And you can look forward to his remarks later. I'm sure they'll be great. But Vince did it in a different way. Instead of just saying that, he said that this reminded him of the story of when the Rolling Stones were the glamorous act following James Brown. And James Brown, the hardest working man in show business, was furious and put on a show for the ages, leading Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones to say that deciding that they would follow the hardest working man in show business was the biggest mistake they made in their career. Vince did things that some of the rest of us did, but he did them with just remarkable grace and elan and panache. Olive is a Jehovah's Witness, and most of you know, but just to be sure, Jehovah's Witnesses don't celebrate Christmas. So come to the end of the year, we've all learned you're not supposed to give Olive a Christmas present. So how did Vince deal with that?
So he would walk in the front door, and coming towards my desk, he would have this beautiful white orchid plant. And what was so nice about it is that it wasn't for the holiday, it was an end-of-year gift. So that's what made it just remarkably beautiful, that he had that kind of respect for me.
And when you were working with him, you were doing secretarial work. Did he ask you to do other things as well?
Well, yeah, besides secretarial work, I would do his proofreading. Boy, would that be a job. I mean, I felt like a lawyer after I finished. I mean, I'm an honorary lawyer somehow, but yes.
All right, let's we're told to be quick, but talk about faculty colleagues. Could you tell whether, the rest of us jerks liked Vince and got along with him?
Oh, indeed, because they would come around my desk and talk to him, and during the conversation, he would talk some philosophical, saying something philosophical or quotation, and they would just laugh and stuff like that, and I'm wondering, say what? But that's Vince. They understood him, they knew him, and the way he talks is I can't think of the philosopher right now that he, but anyway.
It'll come to you, don't
yeah,
worry.
Yeah,
you got it, there it is. All right, talk to me about students.
Loved his contract drafting class.
Oh, really?
Only 12 students could be in the class, but 24 would sign up in 2021. Then there were 29 in 2022 or whatever the year. But they just all wanted, and then they would say things about him that they wanted so much to be in this contract drafting class. Please choose me. And they would have to write as to why they wanted to be in the class. But I'm not going to go into that because I'll be here too long. But yes, Oh, they loved him.
But you could, how about in the contracts? Do people like him as a contracts teacher too?
Yes. Oh, yes. Contracts, and the other one, advanced the sales, advanced sales. Yes, he was just a beloved professor. And nosy as I am, because students are allowed to write their private comments about professors, different professors. And during the SE, what is that form called? The student evaluation form.
Yeah, the
thing.
SED, the set form.
Yeah,
that.
yes. So you could read it, and oh yes, he was loved.
Yes.
Yes.
Olive doesn't quit, for those of you who don't know her, so that only 2 days ago, she sent me an email and said, here are a bunch of the letters that students wrote to him in the most recent year pleading to get into the contract drafting class. I said, so is this from the entire time? And she said, oh no, this is just 1 year, and you got a whole bunch of these letters that come in from students. And I'm just going to end with quotes from 2 of them. What do we got? This is a student. I won't reveal the name. There's probably a confidentiality about that kind of thing. I'm a third-year student. I have been waiting with bated breath to take contract drafting since I first learned about it during contracts class 2020. And then the other one, when I first interviewed for the position at the Wayne County Probate Court, I was almost immediately asked by one of the 6 interviewers if the, quote, king of contracts, close quote, was still around. And of course, everyone knew who the interviewer was talking about. So I just want to say on behalf of me and Olive that it's a privilege to be here, and thank you for sharing with us the king of contracts and the king of collegiality.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ahmed Sabah, and I had the privilege of being one of Professor Wellman's, or as many of you know him, Vince's students during my time here at Wayne Law. Standing here today and listening to all of the remarks already presented, I'm reminded of just how many lives Professor Wellman touched, including my own. Professor Wellman's contracts class was the first class that I had as a 1L at Wayne Law. Suffice to say, I was pretty nervous. I had heard that contracts was tough and that the Socratic method that Professor Wellman and others used could make even the most confident student second-guess themselves. And that was true. But what I learned quickly, with respect to Professor Wellman at least, was that his questions were never meant to intimidate. They were meant to enlighten and really teach. He didn't want us to memorize rules. He wanted us to think like lawyers. And in hindsight, I can say that is one of the things that really sets him apart as a professor, and one of the most valuable things you can do as a professor to law students. Professor Wellman had an incredible ability to connect the law to the real world. He would often bring in stories from his own experiences to make the substance more relatable and easier to understand. One of the stories that stuck with me was about his work advising Ndamukong Suh during his contract extension with the Detroit Lions. Now, he didn't tell it to brag, even though at that point, as a law student, I thought that was the coolest thing you could do as a professor, and I still think that's really sweet. He told it to show us how the legal principles and strategies he was teaching us come together in the real world. He really had a gift for making even the driest legal concepts come alive with real-world examples. If you were ever a student of Professor Wellman's, you may remember, and I'll never forget, the day he explained a breach of contract by saying, if you order a bottle of Chateau Margaux and what arrives at your doorstep is a jug of sangria, that's a breach of contract. I wish his exam answers were, or his exam questions were so straightforward and easy, but that was classic Professor Wellman. Witty, humorous, and always focused on how the law translates to the real world. Beyond his professional accomplishments and substantive abilities, I think what made him special and different as a professor was his kindness. Whether you were clearly on top of your game as a law student or still finding your footing, he treated everyone with the same respect and attention. Professor Wellman leaves behind a remarkable legacy in the matters he influenced, in the colleagues he worked with, and most importantly, in the generations of students who carry what he taught them and his wisdom with them into the real world, including myself. Even today, as a partner at Honigman who practices contract drafting and negotiating on a daily basis, the things I learned from Professor Wellman almost 10 years ago now continue to guide me and influence my practice. So, while we mourn his passing, we also celebrate the countless ways he enriched our lives. I'll always be grateful for the lessons he taught me, and it's really enlightening to hear all of the stories that everyone else has. To me, it seems almost poetic that he passed not long after retiring. Teaching was such an essential part of his life. He did it for 44 years here. He poured himself into his students, and his work was truly his calling. I think that's clear. He dedicated his life to teaching and mentoring, and perhaps, once he shared all that he had to give, his work here was complete. My deepest sympathies and condolences to his family, his loved ones, his colleagues. Thank you all.
So I'm John Weinberg. I was a colleague of Vince's here on the faculty for upwards of 35 years. And starting about 7 years ago, continuing off and on until his death, Vince, Chris Lund, and I had a book club. We would read very slowly through books about legal philosophy, legal history, other topics, talk about them over beer. Sometimes it was, mostly about the beer and the schmoozing. Sometimes it was more about the books. But I was always grateful and sometimes just astonished at the learning that Vince managed to share in those sessions. Now, Chris and I were very much the students, and Vince was, most of the time, the teacher. His knowledge was broad. He was a man of parts and learning. I remember one summer just a few years ago, he was working on a paper about contract formation and also a paper about how Blackstone hadn't carried forward Aquinas' idea that law was a matter of practical rather than deductive reason. Our beer conversations work best when we get a lot to criticize in the book. We were both unhappy with Morton Harwitz's legal history. We share the sense that, as Vince put it, and I'm quoting, Scott Soames's discussion of legal interpretation is dumb. Vince lamented in an email most of the way through Rawls's political liberalism that he hoped the forthcoming chapter on the priority of right would make everything clear. But he said, so far, however, every time I've placed my hopes in the next chapter, those hopes have been dashed. But some of the books were excellent. And I always learned from Vince, whether the books were good or not. I was looking through some old emails from him just now, on a bunch of topics. And what I was struck by most was the generosity, the open-mindedness, and the care, that pervaded them. Whenever I asked him a question or I asked him for a favor, and I did that a lot, he approached it with patience, with seriousness, with a willingness to rethink his views, when the situation called for it. he was, one of the best people I've known, and I'm going to miss him terribly. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Tony Dilloff, recently retired. My remarks will be brief, or at least relatively brief. I don't have a lot to add to what has been said or what likely will be said, but when I think about Vince, I think about three qualities, all of which are reasonably obvious. The first is his deep, sonorous, resonant, far-reaching, and penetrating voice. And the second is the fact that this voice perfectly complements the man's thoughts, thinking, and ideas. They too were deep, penetrating, and far-reaching. Whether at a faculty meeting or a paper presentation, when Vince's name was added to the queue, I knew that we were going to be graced by common sense, insight, perspective, and dare I say, some wisdom. So again, those are two pretty obvious things that I think about when I think about Vince. This leads me to my third point, which I guess is equally obvious in a way. Vince and I, among the faculty, probably most closely shared a certain philosophical background and training. And we thought of ourselves for that reason, or at least I thought of myself, as sharing a certain kinship with him. I found him so generous. How many times I would go into the office, his office, with stuck in some philosophical quandary, be it profound, trivial, or personal, and he would be there to listen to me intelligently, to give advice or reflection, and afterwards, I inevitably felt a little less confused. I recall meeting with him up in Ann Arbor for him to give me his comments on one paper that I was struggling with, or in a local coffee shop talking about some of the intricacies of H.A.L. Hart. He was, again, so generous with his time, and that's really why I'm up here. Not so much to say things you don't know about him, but to have the chance to very publicly thank him for his generosity that he showed to me over all these years.
Today, I'm the guy who gets to follow Tony Dilloff. But you made it easy on me, Tony. When Michael asked me if I wanted to speak, I initially demurred because I wasn't sure I had anything to say other than what everyone has already said. Vince was a terrific colleague. And I've taught at 3 law schools full-time and 4 other law schools as a visitor or an adjunct. And I've had closer friends, but I think Vince was actually the best colleague of any of those faculties. And so I reflected on why, and I say 2 reasons. The first is I think Vince and I had some obvious affinities. He was a trained philosopher, a PhD. I'm a self-taught philosopher. But we share an interest in philosophy and big ideas, even though we're different schools and different ways of thinking about it, but we could talk to each other. I was working on a paper exploring the roots of Charles Sumner's argument in Roberts versus the City of Boston, which is the first school desegregation case in 1849. And that led me to a paper by a Princeton classicist, Gregory Vlastos, on isonomia. And I was really excited about it. I went to Vince and said, I found this great paper by Vlastos. And he says, you know Vlastos? He says, Vlastos got me through graduate school. He said, I'd read Vlastos's work and then I'd write my papers. And the other affinity that we had was a shared sense of lawyering as a craft. And people have talked about that in Vince's case. I have one story which I shared with my colleagues right after Vince passed away. We had a dispute with our contractor who rebuilt our garage, who was, I won't use an expletive, but, and I finally negotiated a settlement with them, and I called up Vince, or I emailed Vince, and I asked him, I said, do you have a good release form that I could copy from, right? I could write the release. And he said, no, I'll do it. And I had the sense that it wasn't even so much about generosity, which of course it was, but I think he just wanted to do it. He just enjoyed doing it, right? That's really a lawyer's lawyer in that sense. The other thing about Vince is why he was such a good colleague, though, and this is my reflection on it, is Vince was a grown-up. He was really centered in himself. He knew who he was comfortable, and I think that's why he was such a great colleague with everybody else. I mean, some people have sharp elbows. Vince didn't have any sharp elbows. He had a dry wit, but no sharp elbows. And so not only do you like being around a person like that, but that's a person from whom you can learn something. And I learned something important for Vince, which I'm going to share with you. At one point, I was in his office bitching and moaning about Wayne. So, Rick, you're going to fix all that, right? And he looked at me and he said, some wise man once told me, and I've come to realize that it's true, and now I share this with people all the time. He said, what you think is malevolence is usually just incompetence.
Hi, everybody. For those who don't know me, I am Kristen Toit. I'm the Director of Legal Research and Writing, and I have had the privilege, I can't believe this though, of working with Vince for 25 years. But I knew Vince beforehand because I also had maybe what was the greater privilege of having Professor Wellman as my contracts professor my first year of law school. 1987, I was this impressionable young law student, and along with my classmates, we thought Professor Wellman was the most intelligent person that we would ever meet in our lives. We were so impressed, intimidated, and if some people have said, he'd never meant to be intimidated. But as a student, he was intimidating because of the respect that we all had for him. I mean, after all, he graduated from Yale Law School, right? And he inspired all of us to be deep thinkers, to be curious about the law. I'm one of those people who, I loved law school, and I have to say that back then, Professor Wellman was one of the reasons why I grew to love law school. And I think that our law school is so lucky and so fortunate that he has represented us to countless numbers of students who have learned from him. We've been very, very lucky to have him. Little did I know back then that I would be doubly blessed to end up years later becoming a fellow faculty member. And as much as I admired and respected him as a young student, I maybe admired and respected him even more as a colleague. And I know by now everybody has said this, but he was so thoughtful. He was the kind of person that for me, and granted it might be because there was a part of me that always, looked up to him as Professor Wellman, but if he offered an opinion, if he spoke at a faculty meeting, I always listened, always. I always found what he said to be meaningful and thoughtful. And I am just grateful for the example that he has been to me in my life. as both a professor and as a colleague.
Hi, my name is Greg Fox, for those who don't know me. I was also a colleague of Vince's, and I have been here a while, since 2002, but Vince was already an established figure at the law school when I arrived. To state things very simply, it was an absolute pleasure to be around Vince at any moment. And that's not something we can say about everyone, even those people that we admire for one reason or another. As people have said, Vince was really the whole package. He was an intensely intelligent person, but also kind and curious to others. A practical person who counseled clients and guided students, but also immensely thoughtful about the philosophical and jurisprudential issues that he thought so profoundly about. And he was also a good citizen of the law school who had strong views about the nature of legal education, but also amazingly good at finding compromises between competing factions that he could summarize neatly as practical solutions. So what an immense joy it was to have Vince as a colleague, to bounce ideas off of, to look to at faculty meetings for wise, calm words and practical solutions, to make sense of complex workplace situations in the sometimes labyrinthine nature of Wayne State University, or just to joke around with, knowing that he would immediately respond in kind. So Vince's intelligence, thoughtfulness, and kindness came through in all these situations and in many others, which others have described. And I will miss him very much.
Wow, what more is there to say? But I'll try. I'm Fred Herring. He'll always be Professor Wellman, not Vince, or as one idiot one time said, Vinny. And Professor Wellman just looked over at him like, what? Seriously, it's an honor. I'll try to be quick. I had him for contracts in jurisprudence and legal process, and then we ran out of classes we could have together. He did get a bottle of wine from me at the end, not sangria. The grades were already in, so I wasn't trying to polish the apple. I do want to thank Laura, Peggy, and Patrick for having the bravery to have this. I see your smile. I know you were a singer. Were you a singer at one time? Yes. He mentioned that, and I said, oh, kind of like Sarah McLachlan or whoever it was in vogue at the time. He said, well, you know. He said, she's very good. You know, a couple of comments. I'll try to keep this to 2 to 3 minutes. I met, by the way, my wife, Rachel Pinsky, is here as well. She had him for jurisprudence. Had it not been for Professor Wellman, we wouldn't have met because after the first year, I was fortunate enough to get a passing grade from him and some others, and I got into University of Michigan, came very close to transferring. And literally, I thought, I have such great teachers here, some of whom are in here, I'm going to stick around. And I did, and I met Rachel, and here we are 30 years later. So thank you for that. He deserves his Wild Strawberries moment. Anybody see the Ingmar Bergman movie? Yes, you're smiling, because I mentioned that once to him in an email about somebody else, and he immediately latched on. We could talk about movies. We disagreed on what Vittorio De Sica's greatest movie was. He liked Garden of Incontinence, and I said, how could you ever say that when there's Bicycle Thief, okay? So now I'm showing off a little bit. And speaking of showing off, he never did he? He never showed off. We got in a little bit of I wouldn't call it a tussle, because that would mean I was actually holding my own in something in legal process, and I finally said, you know, you have an unfair advantage. And he says, what's that? And I said, you're much smarter than me. Which is true, but he never showed off. He loved law, he loved teaching, he loved listening, he was very curious. I knew so little about his personal life, it didn't really matter. I didn't know what his political convictions were, I don't know if he had any, I didn't care, and he taught me to not care, because law is something bigger than that. He would have bristled at the notion of lawfare, even though if lawfare does exist, he would have still bristled at that, because he cared about meaning and moral promises and following through on your word. Speaking of showing off, I remember reading those of us who remember, we would read excerpts of opinions in case books and still trying to figure out what's going on in here. And one was by his bête noir, Richard Posner. He didn't believe in law and economics, he believed in law. And I said, Professor Wellman, what's going on in here? What's he talking about? And he just paused for a minute, and in that mellifluous voice, he said, he's just showing off. And he never wanted to show off. So if I can remember a couple of things, I still quote, Rachel has to hear me. I'm now GC of a company with a large legal staff, and I quote him on different things. One is, I heard somebody say he never showed up as student. He didn't, but one time it was me or somebody else answering a question, and I don't remember him really doing the Socratic method. He never wanted to embarrass people, but he taught by some call and response. And he says, you're answering a question I should have asked. Brilliant. Is that not brilliant? I mean, and I've had to say that a few times to some of my, I don't like the word staff, but some of my colleagues. They didn't get that was kind of damning them with faint praise, okay? Another thing is, before the exam, you'd be really nervous about exams, and he says, some of you, I only have this one chance to grade you. And he said, but they'd say, but Professor Wellman, I knew contracts. And he said, but you didn't show me. I still use that line, not with exams, but just in general. You didn't show me. Another one, I asked him a question before class, and he says, that's brilliant. And I'm thinking, really? He must have misunderstood the question I had. Seriously. There's no false modesty with me. I was maybe above average, but not much more. And he says, just hold that thought, and we'll come to it later. And he said, Fred Herring came up with whatever, and I was slinking down in my seat. And I couldn't really remember what I asked him, first of all, and I didn't really want to be disliked. And I said, I forgot. I mean, what a jerk. And he says, easy come, easy go. I mean, I deserve that, but I use that. I think I used it once, Rachel, on one of my kids, one of our kids, I'm sorry, one of our kids. The last one I'll come up with is I saw another one of his students in here, very nice words. Remember outlines, and you don't want to have open book tests, which are useless. If you haven't already figured out what you need to do, you're not supposed to be bringing in a book. If you're scrolling through the pages, you're lost. He said, but here's what I will do. At the end of the first semester, you can put on everything on an 8x11 sheet, double-sided, everything you want, you can bring that in. And at the end of the year, you can do 2 pages. And I still kept that. Never used it again. Did not use it during the exam, but what is that teaching you? It's teaching you the process of putting everything down. You've already got it. And I see the family nodding. Maybe he did that with you at home. I don't know. For the menus, I don't know. Who knows? But one more thing. At the end of the exam, I thought I knew contracts. I love contracts. I still love contracts. I can be dull about contracts. And you remember blue books, you're scribbling. You have 3 hours, and I said, the dream is over. I didn't show him. I haven't showed him, but in a shameless bid of letting him know that I thought I could do better, I wrote, if I had more time, I'd write less. And what did he write? And I've been scrambling to try to find what he wrote back. A gain for both of us. And I still use that. I use that. I mean, does that sound something familiar that Professor Wellman would say? He did. It wasn't even dry wit. And I thought, shit, what did that mean? I think that moved me from a B+ to an A-, okay? I was never an A student, but I did get through it. Last 2 things. For him, it was all about the learning process. Rachel and I, through the, we're grateful to Rob McGregor for putting him in touch with me. I always tried to respect the line between professors, even though I'm seeing Professor Brown and Professor Weinberg and thinking how much they meant. I tried not to get too involved, but once in a while I'd send an email, and Rob McGregor put us in touch about 8 years ago. And he was more interested in my wife's career, who went from legal aid to the more esteemed thing of writing about food, wine, spirits, whiskey, and everything else. And he didn't care about what I was doing, which is good. he wanted to know all about Rachel, and he'd sit back like this. And by the way, I know I'm all over the place. I'm getting near the end. Thank you. What a handsome guy. Beatific. Just, I love the guy. Last thing. I'm now GC for a company. We've dealt with hundreds, literally thousands and thousands of contracts. We're in 21 countries. You can imagine the skirmishes that could happen. He said, one thing that resonated with me, contracts are good things. They're good things. They're designed to get people together to put something through. It's really important. I never did have his contract formation class, which is for better or worse. But what that told me is it's a moral promise. He would have quibbled on the moral part. He did believe law and morality were different things, and I don't care. I don't care about the unfair advantage. He's wrong. There is a commitment you have to have. You make a promise, you follow through it. I work for somebody who believes that. If the contract doesn't go our way, pay it, okay? And so that's why he thought it was important to get people together to negotiate beforehand, because if you're arguing about it in court, you've lost. I can count on 2 fingers, maybe 1 finger, the time in my 23 years as GC of a large company where we've actually been in court. So for that, I thank him for that. The last thing is I want everybody connected with the law community to thank you. Thank you, and thank you to Professor Wellman, because his lessons and all of your lessons resonate. Thank you very much.
Peter Grace. I was a student of Professor Wellman's. And Professor Wellman wasn't just a great law professor. He truly was a great man. He had a way of connecting with the students, and he made what would normally be a very dense and boring area of law one that was really interesting and very memorable. And many of his nuggets of contract wisdom still stick with me today. Signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours. I still hear that in my head every time we send contracts out for signatures. And 2 fond memories that I have of Professor Wellman that'll stick with me forever that I wanted to share with you all this evening. The first was during my time as a 1L. We bonded over Panda Express in the student union. I love Panda Express. And I saw him eating and grabbing lunch, and I asked him if I can join him as I had a few questions regarding a lecture that we had just had. And what's important here is before I became a lawyer, before I went to law school, I was a middle school teacher. I did not want to sit with my students during lunch. That was the last thing I wanted to do. But Professor Wellman sat with me, and he answered my questions around consideration and whatever I couldn't understand from his class. And he did it not because he had to, because we were in the student union far away from the law school, and he could have told me to, leave him alone. He wanted to eat lunch. He did it because he cared. And that really stuck with me. And the second memory was actually after I had already graduated Wayne Law. I was a first-year associate at a firm. This was around February 2020, so global pandemic, COVID. Great time to start my career as a lawyer. And I was reviewing these contracts for the firm, trying to terminate them, mind you, because the world was shutting down and everybody was freaking out. And I was trying to unpack these force majeure clauses out of these contracts. And I remember thinking to myself that I had no idea what I was doing. I was like, force majeure? I mean, is that even English? I don't know. And I remember thinking I didn't have a clue. And so what did I do? I called Professor Wellman. And he answered me. And I remember in that moment thinking to myself that here we are, we're in a global pandemic. The world is shut down. We're wiping and sanitizing our groceries. And this guy takes the time to answer my questions when he never needed to. And it showed me about him that he really did care, not about just his students when they were his students, but they were lifelong students of his. Force majeure is French. It stems from the Napoleonic Code. I learned that from Professor Wellman. Professor Wellman didn't just teach me about contract law. He taught me how to think differently, how to unpack a contract so that you don't just look at each part independently, but as a whole, holistically. You look at it as one, and how they intertwine, each provision intertwines with each other. And as crazy as it sounds, I use and apply that same holistic way of thinking through all aspects of my life that have nothing to do with the law. He really did change the way that I approach life and the way that I think. That's something that'll stick with me forever. He made me the lawyer I am today. And so while I was deeply saddened to hear about his passing, I do find comfort in knowing that his legacy lives on within all of the students that he touched. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Julia Qin, another colleague of Vince at Wayne Law. I came to Wayne in 2000. At first, we had very little contact in the first few years. Then one year, we both served on the curriculum committee. What fascinated me at the time was that Vince would not write his emails. Instead, he would handwrite his notes and put his notes into our mailboxes. And then, or have Olive write messages for him. So he reminded me of a senior partner at Cleary Gottlieb, Lee Brookhyde, whom I worked with in the late 1990s. Lee was also not writing his own emails and insists on dictating all his messages to his secretary. Lee was a brilliant lawyer and very well known, and also a very old school. So I thought at the time, Vince must be of the same type. Then one day, after the committee meeting, Vince was talking eloquently about law and technology and how his daughter would help him with tech matters, etc. So at that point, I just blurted out, hey, maybe it's time for you to start writing your own emails. He looked a bit surprised, then simply said, touche. Another French. And that response really left a deep impression on me. I realized at the moment Vince was very classy, real grace, real classy guy, and had a great sense of humor. Not long after that, I noticed he started writing his own emails. So another thing I wanted to mention is Vince's generosity. During the pandemic, I was asked by the Associate Dean to teach Contracts B because we needed more teachers to teach smaller 1L classes. The problem is I never taught 1L before, and then that time, it was more than 30 years since I took contracts at law school. So I sent a long email to then Vince seeking advice, and he responded very quickly, just saying that he would be happy to talk to me at any time about anything contracts. Of course, he loves contracts, and that's everybody's, I knew that. And his response really greatly eased my anxiety at the time. So again, he showed real grace in his response. So it's really sad that such a fine man is no longer with us. I just hope he's smiling at us right now from heaven.
Hi. I'm Laura Wellman, Vince Wellman's daughter. Some of you may have met me when I was about this high, but I didn't really know many of you while Dad was still alive. The plan was that I'd get to meet more of you at his retirement party and hear stories of him as Professor Wellman. We weren't able to have that party, as you know, but the Wayne Law community has made sure to share your Professor Wellman stories after all. Now I want to share one of my own. Dad was already teaching at Wayne Law when he met Mom. That means that until this summer, he taught at Wayne for my whole life. I'm told that when I was little, I made the occasional appearance at a contracts or jurisprudence lecture. I confess I don't remember those, although I do recall attending a class or two in my tweens when Patrick was a baby. There was Dad teaching with baby Pat tucked into a sling on his chest, sleeping through the whole thing. As a kid, I liked going to work with Dad because I got to play with the binder clips in his office and read as much as I wanted. But mostly, Wayne was a faraway place Dad went to sometimes. The rhythm of his semester shaped our weeks at home. He'd cook dinner ahead for nights when he'd be away teaching. Every winter around the holidays, there were always exams to grade, a process I understood only as daunting and time-consuming. As an adult, I finally got to hear Professor Wellman teach during the pandemic. Remote work brought our offices closer than they'd ever been, and Dad's workspace was right across from mine. His professor voice sometimes carried through the door, and I was delighted to listen as he built each topic toward the next. I learned that Dad didn't really like teaching remotely. He did his best to make it work, but he struggled to bring class to life to a flat screen full of names. He wanted to see his students' faces, to know whether his message had landed, or if he needed to redirect to try again. That's when I realized how much he loved teaching. I'd always known he enjoyed his subjects and sharing his knowledge, but it wasn't just that. He wanted to make sure each student felt supported and able to connect with the material. He worked to find and foster each student's interest, to contribute to their growth as lawyers, as thinkers, and as people. He was proud of his former students, thrilled to meet one in the wild, hear an update, or best of all, hire a former student who'd built a successful career. Their success was his, too. After his death, your letters poured in. Emails from unfamiliar names describing in beautiful detail what an impact Professor Wellman had made on your lives. It felt like we were meeting Professor Wellman for the first time through your words. Bereft, I wanted to know your Professor Wellman better, so I spent time trying to finish packing up his office. At first, every paper felt unfamiliar, but as I read my way through his files, a story unfolded. It started with his own law school coursework and notes, and early handwritten syllabi from his first classes as a young professor at Wayne. Over the decades, photocopies gave way to printouts, and typewritten letters became emails. I remember the semester he taught in Utrecht as a fun family adventure. Meanwhile, he had a folder of receipts from 1999 and documentation of the professor exchange arrangements. He came up with new contract class scenarios each year. I recognized one or two we'd discussed over dinner when he was filling in the details for his fictional example businesses. I didn't think I knew much about Wayne, but I recognized more than I expected. Dad had files from the early aughts discussing a search for a new dean, binders detailing budget work in the great wake of the Great Recession, folders of proposals for new courses and potential faculty, memos weighing the strengths and weaknesses of course offerings, and draft after draft of student regulations. These were the practical forms of projects I remembered him talking about. But at home, what he shared were his challenges and his hopes, wanting to make the right hiring choices, to strengthen the school's finances for the future, to update and expand the curriculum so the school could remain competitive and effective for the next generation of lawyers. Over the years, he talked about these one by one, but together they formed a picture. For 44 years, he was invested not just in his subjects and his students and his colleagues, but in Wayne Law itself. I want to thank you all for sharing your memories of our beloved Professor Wellman in your letters, your stories, and your words tonight. It turns out that the Professor Wellman you all knew was the same one I did. He brought the same thorough, thoughtful mind to every part of his life, at Wayne and at home. Dad may have taught different subjects to his students as to his children, but he taught all of us according to the same principles, using the same logic. To his students, I think he would have called it modus ponens, that if the premises are true, the conclusion must follow, like this. If you seek truth with care, share knowledge generously, and act with integrity, then the result is a community that will carry your influence forever. And I know the Wayne Law community will carry Professor Wellman's legacy forward. You see, I always knew my dad loved his work. What I have learned from you is that his work loved him back.
Hi, everyone. This has just been a wonderful evening.
with so many great stories and remembrances of someone that we all cared about very much. And I really especially want to thank Peggy, Laura, and Patrick for being here with us, but also for sharing Vince with us for all of those years. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Lance Gable. I got to work with Vince for 19 years, and in many different capacities. And like everyone else has already said, I mean, Laura was just saying how we knew the same person that you did, and I feel that so deeply now, because I feel like all of the things that I jotted down that I wanted to say are things that everyone has already said about Vince's generosity, about his genuineness, about his thoughtfulness. Fred made the comment about Vince connecting or bringing up the idea that contracts brought people together. But really, Vince brought people together. That was fundamentally what he was all about. And when I think of him, probably the enduring image in my mind is going into the faculty lounge, and Vince is sitting at the table, the one by the wall, on the right side. He's wearing his blue shirt, like the one he's wearing in this picture. He might be quickly going through some notes for his class that he's teaching right after the faculty meeting. But anytime you had a conversation with Vince, anytime he raised his hand to ask a question in a talk, or to make a point at a faculty meeting in some of the most complex and contentious discussions we would have sometimes, you always knew that what he said was going to contain wisdom, it was going to contain perspective, it was going to contain that deep thinking that everyone's been talking about. And that was a gift to all of us, his knowledge, his wisdom, his thoughtfulness. And it's something that, I treasure personally, but I know we all treasured about him. He played an important role in our school by sharing that with us and by being a part of all of our lives. And so I guess, another way to, I think, conceptualize this, at least the way that I think about it, is that Vince is somebody who had a very open mind. He was open to ideas. He was open to considering things. He didn't have rigid perspectives. And that's what helped him, I think, be so thoughtful about interacting with all of us. But not only did he have an open mind himself, he opened our minds. He opened the minds of his students. He opened the minds of his colleagues. And he made us think more broadly about so many things. And that was a great gift to us. We'll all miss him dearly. And I'm really grateful to have gotten to know him over all of these years. He gave so much to our community, and we will miss him very much. So thank you all for being here. We have two things before we go. One thing I did want to mention, on the back of the program, the family has created the Professor Vince Wellman Scholarship, and this is something that as a law school, we want to grow this scholarship to support students who intend to take jurisprudence or contract drafting. And that's yet another way that we'll continue to honor Vince's legacy here in the future. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a reception right outside. Do not leave, please stay. Tell more stories, share more of your experiences and remembrances of Vince. And we can convene out there now and continue this discussion, conversation. Thank you all for being here and for being part of this great event.